really aren't fully documented until Constantine's reign, leading some to suspect that later historians mislabeled Diocletian's frontier deployments using a vocabulary that had not been invented yet. We have a good idea that small detachments were posted along the frontiers, but the debate over whether these troops represented the same type of Limitanii forces that Constantine used is still a matter of much debate. What is a matter of less debate is how much all of this increased the overall size of the army. Again, we are working from sources that are further removed from Diocletian's own time as we'd like, but the consensus seems to be that all told, Diocletian took an army roughly 350,000 strong, and cranked it up to about 500,000 by the time he retired. He pulled this off by ordering his agents to engage in some pretty heavy-handed recruitment efforts, which is to say, they didn't linger too long on persuasion before moving right on into conscription. And of course, if you're wondering what the effect this vast increase the size of the military had on the overall economy, as the Romans were essentially transferring 150,000 young men from productive farm labor to non-productive soldiering, well, the answer is that the economy took a pretty substantial hit. A hit we'll get into in more detail in 2 weeks when we look at Diocletian's economic policies. The other matter that is still hotly debated today is how all of this fit together. Back in 1976, Edward Lutwyck advanced a fairly comprehensive theory of what he called defense in depth. What he argued is that Diocletian essentially gave up trying to defend a static line in the sand, and opted instead to weave a web of defense that an enemy could enter at will, but then only make it so far into before becoming permanently entangled. The key to this defense-in-depth strategy was something that we've talked about earlier, but that I haven't mentioned so far today because it wasn't really one of Diocletian's overt reforms. Namely, the intense effort the Romans undertook to build strong defensive walls around every city, town, and granary in sight. These fortified positions became key hinge points for the new defensive strategy, and the reason why the whole system was able to function as conceived. The way it worked was this. Out on the front line, the Limitanii forces would keep an eye on things from a series of small forts connected by a military road. A little bit behind them would be stationed fewer, but larger contingents of cavalry, and a little bit behind them, a large invasion force would then be able to easily blow past the Limitanii, but that was okay, because they could take refuge in their well-supplied, easily defended forts. Then, the invasion force had two options. If the invading army chose to use the Roman roads for easy travel, they would pretty soon hit one of the larger fortified camps, and be forced to choose between besieging it, which would cost them time and resources, or they could bypass it, leaving themselves open to attack from the rear. If, on the other hand, they abandoned the road completely to avoid either of these scenarios, their pace would then be slowed considerably, usually preventing them from making it very much further before they were met by the Roman response. In any event, the enemy would find no easy access to provisions, since the Romans would have all of those locked up behind the walls of their forts, and quickly either retreat out of frustration, or stick around long enough for every Roman soldier in the region to collapse on them simultaneously from all sides. Thus, would the invaders be repelled quickly and efficiently. Now, is this really the way things worked? The answer is we have no idea. Some archaeological evidence, particularly in the East, seems to support Lutwyck's theory, while the rest seems either inconclusive or downright hostile to the notion of a centrally planned defensive web surrounding the empire. Plus, it has been argued persuasively that whatever else you can say about the Romans, you can never say that they just wanted to sit back and wait for attack. True, during the crisis years they were constantly sprinting from this invasion to that, but except for that period, the Romans always wanted to take the fight into enemy territory, and it would have been anathema to their most basic ideologies of warfare to design a system that was premised on a defensive posture. We have ourselves just gone through campaigns on the far side of the Rhine by Diocletian and Maximian, and on the far side of the Tigris by Galerius, both undertaken to preempt possible invasion into the empire. In neither of those cases were the emperors willing to just sit back and catch the enemy in a web. Debate still rages about what exactly Diocletian's overall strategy was, and indeed, whether or not he even had an overall strategy, or whether this was all just randomly hashed out at the local level. But during his reign, we do seem to see wider and deeper force deployment patterns, an increase in the total number of troops, and a concerted effort to create a militarized ring around the empire, all of which suggests that he did have some kind of long-term defensive strategy in mind for the empire. Unfortunately, as with so much of Diocletian's work, the coming civil wars of the Tetrarchy, civil wars Diocletian had tried so hard to prevent, would wind up overwhelming many of his reforms to the military structure, as Rome once again fell back into the familiar pattern of waging eternal war on itself. What we can say for sure, though, is that Diocletian helped the empire transition its military from its classical configuration into the force that would be familiar to students of late antiquity, a force that in time set the stage for the armies that would be familiar to students of the Middle Ages. Rome is already practically running its military out of castles, so can King Arthur really be that far behind? Next week, we will get into one of the other ways that Diocletian set the stage for the next 1,000 years of history by discussing his reorganization of the imperial governmental apparatus. I'll talk more about his reordering of the provinces and some of the non-military aspects of the shift, as well as introduce a new term that we should all be familiar with today, the diocese, those overarching administrative zones that were taken over by the clergy as the empire in the West was falling apart, and whose borders, in many cases, have remained unchanged down to the present day. One last thing I'll mention before we go is that as of today, there are still 7 spots available for the final tour we have scheduled, which runs from May 28 to June 7, 2011. So if you thought you had missed out, or maybe you've been sitting on the fence about coming, by all means, drop by historyofrometour.com, check it out, and sign up. It's going to be really, really fun. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 126, All the King's Men. As you know, when Diocletian came to power in 284, he inherited an empire that had spent the better part of 50 years getting kicked around the neighborhood. Everywhere he looked, things were in shambles. He wanted to revive and restore the empire he had been taught to revere, and as he took over, he faced no greater roadblock to this goal than the problem of the malfunctioning governmental apparatus he now headed. What had happened was that as the military crisis became worse and worse, the government had basically become nothing more than the supply arm of the army. If civilians entered into the government's calculations at all, it was only to determine what they might have that the army might need. Everything else, by the dire necessities of the times, was considered an unimportant distraction. But now that the crisis had subsided, it became clear what sorts of really important things had been deemed unimportant distractions. For example, a functioning judicial system. Basically, everything that you would expect a government to do, the imperial government had ceased to do. It was time then to reinvent that government. As we've seen, this reinvention started at the very top with the establishment of co-emperors, all the way down to the localist of local levels, as Diocletian ensured that wherever there were Romans, the Roman government would be there. The big problem, really, was that too much was getting missed. There are multiple reasons for the fracturing of imperial authority, and the military and political rationales cannot be understated. But on an administrative level, the establishment of the Tetrarchy was an extension of Diocletian's desire to get more people focused on fewer things so that all that stuff that was getting missed would stop getting missed. Had he done nothing else, the simple fact that there were now 4 emperors spread out across the empire instead of just one meant that already 4 times as much work was getting done. 4 times as many letters were being answered, 4 times as many petitions were being ruled on, 4 times as many decisions were being made. And as a bonus, each tetrarch didn't have to worry about what was going on the other side of the empire, leaving him to focus on the management of his particular domain. Which was nice because even though it was just a quarter of the empire, those domains were still a pretty huge chunk of land, and millions of people still lived in them. But of course, the division of imperial authority was not the end of Diocletian's reforms, it was just the beginning. In keeping with the theme of getting more people doing fewer things, Diocletian also set about dividing up the empire into smaller, more manageable provinces. Last week, I focused on the military implications of this reformation, so this week I want to focus on the administrative aspects. There were basically 3 main things here that were of concern: the collection of taxes, the administration of justice, and the maintenance of the infrastructure. All 3 of these core missions had been more or less abandoned as the crisis years wore on, and even before then, the size of an individual province, which was big, and the size of a provincial government, which was small, conspired to make most administrations woefully inadequate with regards to all 3 anyway. Sure, taxes were collected and justice was administered, and the roads were maintained, but not without delays, inefficiencies, and outright failures. When it came to government, Diocletian didn't want to just set things back to the way they had been. He wanted to make the whole operation better. When Diocletian finished drawing his lines all over the map, and I have posted a map of Diocletian's new provincial alignment at thehistoryofrome.typepad.com, the Romans found that their empire now contained over 100 provinces. As with the larger division of the Tetrarchy, the proliferation of new provinces meant that, simply put, governors had less to worry about. And it was a good thing that they had less to worry about, because Diocletian was going to expect more of them than any previous emperor had. For example, he sent out instructions that he expected his governors to be active participants in the judicial system. They were not to ignore petitions or appeals, and they were not to hand them off to subordinates. They had been made the supreme legal authority in their province, and they were damn well going to act like it. It used to be easy to shirk these responsibilities because the absolute flood of plaintiffs and defendants who would come calling made for an easy excuse, but even the most conscientious governor had no hope of dealing with it all himself. So, smaller provinces, and voila, a reasonably sized caseload. I don't want to belabor these points because I think you get the general idea, but suffice it to say that smaller provinces also meant that it was easier to track down tax evaders, and it was easier to notice when a dilapidated building needed to be repaired. More people focused on fewer